What if a single folded napkin could be the difference between life and death for the city's most feared man? In a world of shadows and secrets, where power is measured in loyalty and blood, the most unlikely person can change everything. This is the story of a shy waitress, lost in the noise of the city, and the Mafia boss whose life hung by a thread she didn't even know she held. It wasn't a glance, a touch, or a shared word that connected them. It was a hastily scribbled note, a silent warning that would ignite a firestorm of passion, betrayal, and danger, proving that sometimes the quietest voice is the one that echoes the loudest. The clatter of plates and the low hum of conversations at the Gilded Spoon were the soundtrack to Alice's life. It was a high-end diner that pretended to be more than it was, with leatherette booths and brass railings that were always a little sticky. For Alice, it was a purgatory of lukewarm coffee and meager tips, a place to be invisible while she paid off the student loans for a degree she'd never had the chance to use. She was a ghost in her own life, moving between tables with a practiced quietness, her eyes perpetually downcast, her light brown hair always pulled back in a severe, functional bun. Tonight, the air was different. It was thick with an unspoken tension, a static charge that made the hairs on her arms stand up. It arrived in the form of a man who didn't walk into the diner so much as consume it. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly at odds with his formidable presence. He was tall, dressed in a tailored Brioni suit, the color of a midnight sky, his dark hair impeccably styled, and his face a study in severe, handsome lines. But it was his eyes that held the room hostage, dark, intelligent, and utterly devoid of warmth. They missed nothing. He sat in the back booth, the one usually reserved for tourists or teenagers on an awkward date. His two companions, mountains of men in their own right, stood sentinel near the entrance, their gazes sweeping the room with a professional paranoia. The usual diner chatter faltered, conversations dying in throats as patrons felt the shift in atmosphere. This was Alessandro De Luca. Alice knew the name. Everyone in the city knew the name, spoken in whispers. They called him the Ghost, because his enemies had a habit of disappearing, and he himself was rarely seen. He was the head of the De Luca crime family, a man who commanded an empire built on secrets and fear. And he was sitting in her section. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her manager, a weaselly man named Frank, scurried over, his face pale. "Alice, table 12. Just take his order. Don't stare, don't speak unless spoken to, and for God's sake, don't spill anything." Taking a shaky breath, Alice grabbed her notepad. As she approached the table, it felt like walking into a vacuum. The ambient noise of the diner seemed to recede, leaving only the sound of her own frantic pulse. "Good evening, sir. May I get you something to drink?" Her voice was a mouse's squeak. Alessandro De Luca didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the street outside the large plate glass window, his expression unreadable. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in the air. "Macchiato, double shot, no sugar." "Of course." She practically fled. Behind the counter, her hands trembled as she prepared the coffee. That's when she heard it. Two men had entered the kitchen through the back service entrance, bypassing the main dining room. They were talking to one of the dishwashers, a jittery kid named Leo. They were speaking in a Sicilian dialect Alice hadn't heard in years, not since her grandmother was alive. Her nonna had insisted she learn it, calling it the language of secrets. "Is he here?" The first man, burly and florid-faced, asked Leo in the dialect. Leo nodded, not making eye contact. "The back booth, like you said." "Good boy." The second man, leaner and with a cruel slash of a mouth, said, pressing a few bills into Leo's hand, "The powder is colorless, tasteless. Our man at the bar, the one in the grey suit, he'll create a distraction. You just make sure this one," he gestured vaguely towards the front, "delivers the cup." He clearly meant her. His plan was to intercept her on the way to the table. A cold dread, sharp and absolute, pierced through Alice's fear. They were going to poison Alessandro De Luca, and they were going to use her to do it. Her mind raced. She couldn't scream. She couldn't run to the police. Who would believe a waitress against these men? They would kill her without a second thought. And De Luca, he was a monster, a criminal, but no one deserved to be executed in a diner over coffee. Her eyes darted around. She saw the notepad in her hand, the pen clipped to her apron. An idea, insane and terrifying, sparked in her mind. She finished the macchiato, her movement stiff. As she placed it on the saucer, she tore a small corner from her notepad. Her hand shaking so violently she could barely form the letters, she scribbled 4 words: grey suit, poison, leave. She folded the tiny piece of paper into a minuscule square and palmed it. Her heart was a wild bird trapped in her chest. The 2 men were now lurking near the kitchen's exit, waiting for her to pass. The man in the grey suit was at the bar, as they'd said, nursing a whiskey and watching De Luca's reflection in the mirror behind the bottles. She had to bypass the assassins. She took the long way around, circling the counter under the pretense of grabbing extra napkins. Her path now took her past the edge of De Luca's booth from the other side. As she approached, she kept her eyes down. Time seemed to slow. She could feel the stares of the 2 men by the kitchen, the burn of the grey-suited man's gaze. Alessandro De Luca was still looking out the window, a statue of deadly stillness. With a movement so subtle she wasn't sure she'd even done it, she let her hand brush the edge of the table as she passed. She didn't place the note. She didn't drop it. She simply relaxed her fingers, letting the tiny folded square slip from her damp palm and land silently on the dark leather of the booth, right beside his hand. She continued on her path, her legs feeling like lead, not daring to look back. She set the coffee down on his table from the proper side, her hand leaving a slight tremor on the saucer. "Your macchiato, sir," she whispered, her voice cracking. He still didn't look at her. He just gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. Alice retreated, her entire body screaming. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, real and imagined. She busied herself at a nearby station, wiping down an already clean counter, her back to his table. She waited for a commotion, a shout, an accusation. Instead, there was silence, a thick, heavy silence. Then, she heard the soft scrape of a chair. Through the reflection in the polished chrome of the espresso machine, she saw Alessandro De Luca stand up. He hadn't touched his coffee. He smoothly placed a $100 bill on the table. He hadn't looked at the note. Not that she saw. Had he even noticed it? Had it fallen to the floor? Just as he turned to leave, his dark eyes finally, for the briefest of moments, met hers in the reflection. It was not a look of gratitude or acknowledgement. It was a look of cold, calculating assessment, an inventory of her soul. It was a look that said, "I see you," and then he was gone, his bodyguards falling in around him as they swept out of the diner, leaving a wake of stunned silence and the untouched macchiato, cooling on the table. A moment later, chaos erupted. The man in the grey suit cursed loudly, knocking over his stool and shouting at the bartender. It was the planned distraction. But it was too late. Their target had vanished. Alice leaned against the counter, her knees weak, the adrenaline leaving her cold and shaky. She hadn't just served a coffee. She had stepped into a war, and she had a terrifying feeling that the most dangerous man in the city now knew her name. The ride back to the DeLuca stronghold, a penthouse that occupied the entire top floor of a sleek, black skyscraper known as the Onyx, was silent. Alessandro sat in the back of the armored Cadillac Escalade, the city lights painting fleeting streaks across his impassive face. His right hand was clenched into a fist in his lap. Inside it, he could feel the faint, crinkled edges of the tiny piece of paper. He had felt it land beside his hand, a touch as light as a moth's wing. His senses, honed by years of navigating a world where a careless breath could get you killed, had registered the anomaly immediately. He hadn't reacted, hadn't turned. Instead, he'd used the reflection in the window to see the waitress, plain, nervous, utterly forgettable, walk away. He'd seen the tension in her shoulders, the way she refused to look back. Then, his eyes had flicked to the bar, settling on a man he recognized, Julian Croft, a mid-level enforcer for the Falcone family, his most bitter rivals. Croft, in a cheap grey suit, was trying far too hard to look casual. Everything had clicked into place with chilling precision. With a movement hidden by the angle of his body, he'd swept the note into his palm as he stood. He hadn't needed to read it until now. In the secure quiet of the car, he opened his hand. Grey suit. Poison. Leave. 3 words. A declaration of war from the Falcones and an act of salvation from a nobody. The sheer audacity of the attempt in such a public place infuriated him. They were getting bolder. But the waitress, she was an enigma. How could she possibly have known? Who was she? A plant? A terrified bystander? They swept into the private underground garage of the Onyx. The moment the doors of the penthouse hissed open, Alessandro was in motion. His second-in-command, Marco Varelli, a man whose loyalty was as much a part of him as his own shadow, met him in the foyer. "Boss? What happened?" The plan was for another hour. Marco was sharp, his eyes already assessing Alessandro's grim mood. Alessandro didn't answer immediately. He walked past the sprawling white marble floors, past art pieces that could fund a small country, and into his office. The room was encased in floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a godlike view of the glittering city below. He placed the note on his massive obsidian desk. "The Falcones made a move," Alessandro said, his voice dangerously soft. "At the diner. Poison." Marco's face hardened. "Who was the vector?" "They tried to use the waitress." He watched Marco for any flicker of recognition, but there was none. "She warned me." He pushed the note across the desk. Marco picked it up, his brow furrowing as he read the shaky handwriting. How in God's name did a waitress know about a hit from the Falcones? "That is the question of the hour," Alessandro said, turning to look out at the city. It was his kingdom, and a snake had just tried to bite him in his own court. "I want to know everything about her. Her name, her address, her family, her favorite color, every debt she has, every secret she keeps. I want to know who she breathes the same air as. I want her history from the day she was born. Do it quietly. No one can know we're looking. The Falcones will be searching for the leak. I want to find her before they do." "And the traitor in the diner? The dishwasher?" Marco asked. "Find him too. Bring him here. I want to have a conversation with him about his poor life choices." Alessandro's tone left no room for doubt about the conversation's finality. "Consider it done," Marco said, pocketing the note. "I'll start with the diner's employee records." He paused at the door. "What do you want to do with her when we find her?" Alessandro was silent for a long moment. He was a man who dealt in absolutes, in assets and liabilities. The girl was a dangerous loose end. Standard procedure dictated that she disappear. But standard procedure didn't account for the spark of desperate courage it must have taken for her to pass him that note. She hadn't run screaming. She had acted with a subtlety that belied her terrified demeanor. "For now," Alessandro said, his voice a low command. "We just find her, and we protect her. She's a ghost, Marco, until I say otherwise." Meanwhile, Alice's shift ended in a blur of anxiety. She cleaned her section on autopilot, her body screaming with a primal need to flee. Every new customer who walked in sent a fresh spike of terror through her. Was it one of them? Had they come back for her? She practically ran home to her tiny, run-down apartment in a part of the city that the postcards ignored. The building smelled of damp and boiled cabbage. She locked her door, slid the chain across, and wedged a chair under the knob, her heart still pounding a frantic rhythm. She sank onto her lumpy mattress, pulling a thin blanket around her. Sleep was an impossibility. Her mind replayed the scene over and over. The glint in the assassin's eye, the shaky feel of the pen in her hand, the chilling, final look from Alessandro De Luca in the reflection of the espresso machine. She had saved a killer. A powerful, ruthless man who likely wouldn't hesitate to erase her to tie up a loose end. But the alternative, watching a man be murdered, knowing she could have stopped it, was something she couldn't live with. Her nonna had always told her, "Courage, mia cara, is not the absence of fear. It is doing what is right when you are terrified." But what if doing the right thing had just signed her own death warrant? She was trapped. The Falcones, if they ever discovered who had foiled their plan, would hunt her down. And Alessandro De Luca, he was the bigger mystery. Would he see her as an asset or a liability? A savior or a witness? The next 2 days were a blur of heightened paranoia. Every creak of the floorboards in the hall, every siren in the distance, sent her jumping. At work, she was a wreck, dropping a tray of glasses and earning a scathing lecture from Frank. The dishwasher, Leo, was gone. He just hadn't shown up for his shift. No one knew where he was. Alice knew. She felt a cold sickness in her stomach. On the third night after the incident, as she was walking home under the sickly orange glow of the streetlights, a black sedan with tinted windows pulled up silently beside her. Her blood ran cold. This was it. The back door opened. A man in an expensive suit, his face calm and professional, stepped out. It was Marco. "Alice Romano?" he asked. His voice was polite, but his eyes were hard as steel. Alice couldn't speak. She could only nod, her body frozen in place. "Mr. De Luca would like a word with you," Marco said. It wasn't a request. "Please get in the car. It's for your own safety." Safety. The word sounded like a mockery. She knew she had no choice. To run would be to die tired. To refuse would be to die right here on this grimy sidewalk. Numbly, she allowed herself to be guided into the plush leather interior of the car. The door closed with a heavy, final thud, sealing her in with the shadows. As the car pulled away from the curb, she watched her familiar, bleak world disappear behind her, certain she would never see it again. The ride was suffocatingly silent. Alice sat ramrod straight, her hands clenched in her lap, her gaze fixed on the blur of city lights outside the window. She didn't dare look at the man beside her, Marco, who sat with the unnerving stillness of a predator at rest. They weren't heading toward the industrial docks or a desolate warehouse like in the movies. Instead, the car ascended, climbing the glittering spine of the city towards the most exclusive district, finally pulling into the hushed, fortified entrance of the Onyx. The sheer opulence of the building was dizzying. As she was led through the private elevator and directly into the penthouse, Alice felt like she had stepped into another reality, The space was vast and minimalist, a symphony of white marble, black chrome, and glass. The panoramic view of the city skyline was breathtaking, a carpet of diamonds laid at their feet. It was beautiful, but it felt cold, sterile, and utterly soulless. It was a fortress disguised as a home. Alessandro De Luca was standing by the windows, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, looking down on his kingdom. He turned as she entered, and the full force of his presence hit her again. Here, in his own environment, he seemed larger, more powerful, an elemental force of control and authority. "Leave us," he commanded Marco, his eyes never leaving Alice. Marco nodded and retreated, the sound of the elevator doors closing, echoing the finality of a prison gate. They were alone. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and threats. Alice's fear was a living thing, a cold knot in her stomach, but a tiny spark of defiance flickered within it. If she was going to die, she wouldn't do it cowering. She lifted her chin and met his gaze. "Miss Romano," he began, his voice a silken rumble. He swirled the liquid in his glass. "We have a problem, you and I." "I didn't ask for any of this," she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. "And yet, here we are," he countered, taking a slow step towards her. "You saved my life, an act for which I am grateful. However, in doing so, you have made yourself a primary target for my enemies and a significant liability to me." He stopped a few feet from her. He was so close she could smell the faint scent of his cologne, a clean, sharp fragrance of bergamot and cedar, a stark contrast to the danger that radiated from him. "So I have one question for you, Alice Romano," he said, his eyes boring into hers. "How did you know?" This was the moment. Her answer would determine her fate. She took a breath, the truth her only possible shield. "My grandmother," she began, the words tumbling out. "She was from Corleone, in Sicily. She made me learn the old dialect. She said it was important to know the language of your roots, the language of secrets." Alessandro's expression remained unchanged, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Interest. "The two men who came into the kitchen, they were speaking it," she continued. "They were talking to one of the dishwashers. They thought no one could understand them. They said a man in a grey suit at the bar would create a distraction and that they were going to use me to deliver the cup. They mentioned poison." She finally looked away from his intense gaze, her own eyes finding a meaningless spot on the marble floor. "I didn't know what to do. I couldn't let them. I just couldn't. The note was all I could think of." He was silent for a long time, studying her. He was a man who analyzed every angle, every possibility. Her story was improbable, yet it had the undeniable ring of truth. No one could invent such a specific, obscure detail on the fly. He had assumed a complex conspiracy, a double agent, a mole. The reality was far simpler and infinitely more complicated. A random waitress with a dead grandmother's gift. "Your grandmother was a wise woman," he said finally, his tone softening almost imperceptibly. "Your knowledge of that dialect makes you unique and very dangerous." He turned and walked back to the window. "The Falcones know their plan failed. They know there was a leak. They are currently tearing the city apart looking for the source. The dishwasher you mentioned, Leo, is dead. They got to him before we did. They tortured him. If they find you—" He let the sentence hang in the air, the implication clear and terrifying. Alice felt a wave of nausea. Poor Leo. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Are you going to kill me to silence me?" Alessandro turned to face her fully, a faint, mirthless smile touching his lips. It would be the simplest solution, but it would be a waste, and I am not a man who appreciates waste. He set his glass down with a soft click. No, Miss Romano, you are not going to die. You are going to stay here, in this apartment. You will have everything you need: food, clothes, books, anything you desire. But you will not leave. You will not contact anyone from your old life. My man Marco will be your sole point of contact. To the world, Alice Romano has simply vanished. The reality of his words crashed down on her. You're keeping me prisoner. I am keeping you alive, he corrected her, his voice hard as flint. This is not a negotiation. You are in my world now. The only safety you have is the safety I provide. Think of it as a gilded cage. The cage is for your protection. The gilding is a reward for your service. Tears of frustration and fear pricked at her eyes, but she fought them back. She would not cry in front of him. For how long? For as long as it takes, he replied, his answer absolute. For as long as Isabella Falcone is a threat. He gestured to a hallway she hadn't noticed before. Marco will show you to your room. Get some rest. We will talk more tomorrow. As if summoned, Marco appeared at the entrance to the hall. Alice looked from him to Alessandro, the powerful, handsome monster who now owned her life. She was trapped, a bird in a cage of marble and glass, 30 stories above a city that no longer knew she existed. As she followed Marco down the silent, art-lined hallway, she wondered which was worse, the danger she had faced from the assassins, or the chilling, possessive protection of Alessandro De Luca. The days that followed bled into one another in a haze of luxurious confinement. The room Alice was given was larger than her entire apartment, with a king-sized bed, an ensuite bathroom of stunning black marble, and a closet that Marco had summarily filled with clothes from high-end designers she'd only ever seen in magazines. A small library off the main living area was stocked with books, and the kitchen was filled with food she could only have dreamed of. It was, as Alessandro had promised, a gilded cage. But it was a cage nonetheless. Her only human contact was Marco, who brought her meals when Alessandro was out, and a silent, stern-faced cleaning woman who came twice a week. Marco was polite, but distant, answering her questions with curt, non-committal replies. He was a wall, impossible to read, his loyalty to Alessandro absolute. Alessandro himself was an enigma. He was often gone for long stretches, sometimes for an entire day and night. When he was present, the penthouse vibrated with his energy. Alice found herself listening for the sound of the private elevator, her body tensing in a mixture of fear and a strange, unwelcome anticipation. Their conversations were stilted at first. He would find her in the library or staring out at the city from the massive windows, and he would ask her questions, not about the night at the diner, but about her, about the books she was reading, about the degree in art history she had abandoned, about her grandmother. She was hesitant, guarded, but the suffocating loneliness of her confinement made her talk. She spoke of her passion for Renaissance art, for the stories hidden in the brushstrokes of a Caravaggio painting. She told him about her nonna, a fierce, loving woman who smelled of garlic and rosemary, who had filled her childhood with stories and a strength Alice thought she'd lost. Alessandro listened. He would sit across from her, his dark eyes watching her with an unnerving intensity. And he would just listen. He rarely spoke of himself, but she began to piece together a portrait of the man behind the monster. She saw the immense weight of the empire he commanded, the constant pressure of betrayal that surrounded him. She noticed the way he would rub the back of his neck when he was stressed, the slight, weary slump in his shoulders when he thought no one was watching. One evening, He came into the library where she was sketching in a notepad Marco had provided. He stood behind her, watching in silence. She was drawing the face of a statue from one of the art books. "You have talent," he said, his voice startling her. She closed the book quickly. "I'm out of practice." "Why did you stop?" he asked, his question genuine. "Life," she answered with a small, bitter shrug. "My parents died when I was 19. I had to take care of my younger brother, Liam. I took whatever jobs I could get. The diner was just the latest. Art school became a luxury I couldn't afford." "This brother," Alessandro said, his tone shifting, becoming more analytical. "Where is he now?" A pang of guilt and worry hit her. "We don't talk much. He got into some trouble. Gambling. I tried to help him, but he pushed me away. He lives somewhere downtown, moving from place to place." She hadn't spoken to Liam in over a year. The thought of him, vulnerable and alone, was a constant, dull ache. Alessandro filed the information away without comment. Instead, he pointed to the book. "Tell me about this one, Caravaggio's The Calling of St. Matthew." And so she did. She spoke of the chiaroscuro, the dramatic interplay of light and shadow, explaining how the light in the painting wasn't divine, but a harsh, realistic light, illuminating the common men in the tavern. He painted saints who looked like sinners, and sinners who could be saints, she explained, her passion for the subject making her forget who she was talking to. He saw the humanity in the darkness. When she finished, she looked up and found Alessandro staring at her, his expression unreadable. "Humanity in the darkness," he repeated softly, as if tasting the words. An interesting perspective. A strange sort of intimacy began to grow in the sterile silence of the penthouse. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was a connection. He started bringing her things, rare art books he had acquired, a specific brand of charcoal pencils she mentioned she liked, small gestures that spoke volumes. In return, she offered him something he likely hadn't had in years, a conversation with no agenda, a perspective untainted by fear or ambition. One night, he returned late, a fresh cut on his cheekbone and his suit jacket stained with something she prayed wasn't blood. He looked exhausted, the mask of invincibility stripped away. He went straight to the bar and poured himself a whiskey, downing it in one go. Alice found herself walking towards him. "Are you all right?" He gave a harsh, short laugh. "Define all right." He poured another. "Julian Croft, the man in the grey suit from the diner. We found him. He confirmed he was working for Isabella Falcone." Alessandro's voice turned to ice. "He also confirmed they have a source inside my organization. Someone is feeding her information." The reality of his world, violent and treacherous, slammed back into her. "The betrayal of an enemy is expected," Alessandro said, staring into his glass. "It's the betrayal of a friend that leaves a scar." On impulse, she reached out and took a clean cloth from the bar, dabbing it with some water from a carafe. She walked over to him, and with a hand that trembled only slightly, she gently began to clean the cut on his cheek. He froze, his entire body going rigid at her touch. He was not a man who was touched, but he didn't pull away. He stood perfectly still, his dark eyes locked on hers, watching her as she carefully cleaned the wound. Her touch was soft, hesitant, and utterly devoid of fear. In that moment, she wasn't his prisoner, and he wasn't her captor. They were just a man and a woman, standing in a quiet room, with the glittering, lonely city spread out beneath them. When she was done, she pulled her hand back, the spell broken. The air crackled with a tension that was entirely new. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something else, something far more dangerous. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low whisper. It was the first time he had ever thanked her for anything. And in the gilded silence of their shared prison, Alice realized with a terrifying certainty that the cage's bars were beginning to feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. And she was more afraid of that than she had ever been of him. The fragile truce in the penthouse, the quiet world Alice and Alessandro were building, was destined to shatter. The outside world, with its vipers and debts, was patient, but it always collected. The first crack appeared in the form of a name: Liam Romano. Alessandro was in his office, a secure, soundproofed room that served as the nerve center of his operations. Marco stood before his desk, his face grim. "We have a problem," Marco stated, forgoing any preamble. "Isabella Falcone has found your waitress's brother." Alessandro's blood ran cold. He had Marco keep tabs on Liam, a low-level surveillance to ensure the boy didn't draw the wrong kind of attention. He was a known degenerate, bouncing between backroom poker games and loan sharks, a mess of a human being. But he was Alice's blood, her only weakness. And Isabella Falcone, a woman who collected weaknesses like trophies, had found him. How? Alessandro's voice was lethally calm. He owes money, a lot of it, to a shark who, it turns out, is on the Falcone payroll. They let his debt spiral, then they called it in. He couldn't pay, so they offered him a deal, Marco explained, his disgust evident. He makes a phone call to his sister. He tells her he's in desperate trouble and needs to see her. He gives her a time and a place. If she shows up, his debt is cleared. It was a classic, brutal trap. Isabella wasn't just trying to get to Alice. She was trying to force Alessandro's hand, to draw him out, to prove he had a weakness. "They want to confirm she's with me," Alessandro surmised, his mind racing through scenarios. "If she, a missing person, shows up to a meeting, they'll know she's under my protection. It exposes her, and it exposes me." "What are your orders?" Marco asked. Alessandro stared at the city lights, his jaw tight. The logical, cold-hearted move was to cut the brother loose, sacrifice the pawn to protect the king and queen. Liam Romano was a liability he had never asked for. Letting the Falcones take him would send a message that Alessandro was untouchable, that he wouldn't be manipulated by sentiment. But then he thought of Alice. He pictured her face, animated and bright as she spoke of art. He remembered the soft, hesitant touch of her hand on his cheek. He thought of the deep, painful love she still held for the brother who had abandoned her. To let him be taken would be to destroy a part of her, the part that hadn't yet been hardened by the world, the part he found himself wanting to protect more than his own empire. "We don't let her know," Alessandro commanded. "Not yet. Find out the location and the time of the proposed meeting. Get my men in place. I want eyes on every rooftop, every alleyway. We are going to walk into Isabella's trap, but we are going to be the ones who spring it." The plan was risky, bordering on insane. But the alternative, seeing the light in Alice's eyes extinguish, was unthinkable. That evening, Alice sensed a change in him. The quiet companionship of the past few weeks was gone, replaced by the cold, distant mafioso she had first met. He was distracted, pacing, taking hushed, tense calls in his office. The walls were back up, higher and thicker than before. The shift hurt more than she cared to admit. 2 days later, Marco approached her. His face was a mask of professional concern. "Alice, we have a situation. Your brother Liam has been in contact. He's in serious trouble." Alice's heart stopped. "What? What kind of trouble? Is he okay?" "He has a substantial gambling debt," Marco said, choosing his words carefully, sticking to the script Alessandro had given him. The people he owes money to are unforgiving. He needs $10,000 by tomorrow night, or they're going to hurt him. Oh God, she breathed, sinking into a chair. $10,000. It might as well have been 10 million. I don't have it. I have nothing. Alessandro is willing to provide the money, Marco continued. He wants to help you. But the exchange has to be handled carefully. You will be taken to a neutral location. You give Liam the money, you make sure he's safe, and you leave. We will have men everywhere. You will be completely protected. Relief warred with suspicion. Why would Alessandro do this? It was an incredible risk, but the thought of Liam being hurt overshadowed everything else. Yes, of course. Anything. The next night, the air in the penthouse was electric with tension. Alice dressed in the simple, dark clothes Marco had laid out for her. When she emerged, Alessandro was waiting. He wasn't in one of his immaculate suits, but in black tactical pants and a dark Henley shirt that stretched across his powerful chest. He looked less like a CEO and more like a soldier going to war. You will do exactly as Marco says, he told her, his voice leaving no room for argument. You will not deviate from the plan. You will not linger. You give him the bag, you tell him to disappear, and you get back in the car. Do you understand? She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He stepped closer, his hand coming up to gently cup her jaw. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. It was a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that it stole her breath. Be safe, Alice. The drive to the meeting spot, a desolate warehouse district by the industrial canal, was nerve-wracking. The plan was for her and Marco to go in alone, to appear vulnerable, while a dozen of Alessandro's men, including Alessandro himself, were hidden in the surrounding darkness. The chosen location was an abandoned shipyard, littered with rusted containers and decaying equipment. Liam was standing alone, under a single, flickering floodlight, looking pale and terrified. As Marco parked the car, he handed her a small black duffel bag. Remember the plan. Alice got out, her legs unsteady. The bag felt heavy in her hand. As she walked towards her brother, the memories of their shared childhood, of a time before the gambling and the lies, flooded her. "Liam!" she called out, her voice echoing in the eerie silence. He looked up, his face a mixture of shame and desperation. "Alice, I'm so sorry. I didn't know who else to call." "Here," she said, holding out the bag. "Take it. And Liam, please, you have to stop this. Get out of the city. Start over." He reached for the bag, but just as his fingers brushed against it, a voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the night. How touching. A family reunion. Alice spun around. Figures emerged from the shadows behind the containers, and at their lead was a woman. She was strikingly beautiful, with fiery red hair and eyes as cold and green as sea glass. She wore a long black coat and a smile that was all predator. This was Isabella Falcone. Liam scrambled away from Alice, his betrayal complete. "I'm sorry, Alice. They promised." Bright floodlights suddenly blazed to life, illuminating the entire shipyard, catching them all in a blinding glare. Alice saw at least 20 armed Falcone men surrounding them. Marco, his hand on his weapon, was hopelessly outnumbered. They had walked into a trap far bigger and more complex than they had anticipated. Isabella's cold eyes weren't on Alice. They were scanning the shadows, searching. "Come now, Alessandro," she called out, her voice laced with mocking amusement. "I know you're out there. You didn't really think I'd make it this easy, did you? I have your little songbird. Come out, wherever you are. Or she and your man here will be the first to die. Alice's heart plummeted. Isabella hadn't just wanted to confirm a link. She had used Liam to set an ambush, to trap not just Alice, but Alessandro himself. From the shadows atop a shipping container, a figure detached itself from the darkness. Alessandro De Luca stepped into the light, his face a mask of controlled fury. He was alone, his hands empty. "Isabella," he said, his voice a low growl that carried across the shipyard. "This is between you and me. Let her go." Isabella laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. "Oh, I don't think so. You see, I've finally found it. The one thing in this world you actually care about. And now," she said, gesturing to Alice, "it's mine." A Falcone soldier grabbed Alice's arm, pressing the cold barrel of a gun to her temple. The gilded cage had been broken open, only for her to be thrown into a den of wolves. And Alessandro, the monster who had become her protector, had just walked in right behind her. The air in the shipyard was thick with hatred, a palpable thing that coiled around the floodlit space. Alessandro stood exposed, a lone king on a chessboard, deliberately placing himself in check. His men were hidden, awaiting his signal. But Isabella had anticipated him, her forces outnumbering his 2-1. A firefight would be a massacre, and Alice would be the first casualty. "You've become sentimental, Alessandro," Isabella taunted, circling Alice like a shark. The great ghost De Luca, brought to heel by a little brown mouse from a diner. "I must admit, I'm disappointed." "Let her go, Isabella," Alessandro repeated, his voice dangerously low. "Your fight is with me." "Everything is my fight now," she hissed, her eyes blazing. "You took my father's territory. You bled my family dry. Tonight, the scales are balanced. You have a choice. Lay down your weapon, order your men to stand down, and walk away from your empire, or watch her die." It was an impossible choice. His empire was everything he had built, his father's legacy, the source of his power and survival. To give it up was to sign his own death warrant. But to let Alice die, the thought was a physical pain, a blade twisting in his gut. He looked at her, held captive, her eyes wide with terror, but also with a surprising strength. She wasn't crying. She was watching him, a silent plea and a statement of trust all in one. Behind him, hidden from Isabella's view, Marco was communicating silently with their men via a hidden earpiece, feeding Alessandro intel. Snipers are in position, but her personal guards are shielding her. No clean shot. Alessandro's mind worked furiously, calculating odds, running scenarios. Brute force was a losing game. He needed to change the rules. "You talk of my sentimentality," Alessandro called out, his voice steady. "But you forget my reputation, Isabella. I am not a sentimental man." "She," he said, giving a cold, dismissive glance towards Alice, "was a convenience, a source of information. Nothing more." Alice flinched as if he had struck her. The words were a physical blow, shattering the fragile bond they had built. She saw the monster again, the cold, calculating man from the first night. Was this all she was to him? A pawn? Isabella laughed. "A nice try, Alessandro, but I saw the way you looked at her when you stepped out of the shadows. I know a man's weakness when I see it." "Then you see what you want to see," he shot back. "But let's make a different deal. One worthy of us. You want my empire? You'll have to take it. But you also have a leak in your own house. The information about this meeting, it was too perfect. Your trap was too well laid." He was bluffing, sowing discord, buying time. But as he spoke, his eyes were darting around, not at Isabella's soldiers, but at his own men, the ones he could see in the periphery. And then he saw it. A slight, almost imperceptible hand signal from one of Isabella's men to a figure standing near Marco. The figure was Vincent, Marco's trusted lieutenant. In that split second, the horrifying truth crashed down on Alessandro. The mole wasn't some low-level thug. The betrayal wasn't from a stranger. It was from within his own inner circle. Vincent had been feeding Isabella information for years, orchestrating this entire confrontation. He had known Alessandro's plan, the number of men, their positions. He had led them into a perfectly designed slaughterhouse. The knowledge was a cold stone in his stomach. The man who had organized his security, who had sat in his most private meetings, was a traitor. "You're stalling," Isabella said, growing impatient. She nodded to the man holding Alice. "Perhaps a little demonstration is in order." The man cocked his gun. "No!" Alessandro yelled, taking a step forward. And in that moment of distraction, the real gambit began. It wasn't about him or Isabella. It was about Vincent. "Marco!" Alessandro's voice was a roar of command, but it held a coded urgency that only Marco would understand. "Plan B! Now!" Marco, trusting his boss implicitly, even without knowing the full picture, didn't hesitate. He drew his weapon, but he didn't fire at Isabella's men. He turned and fired 2 shots directly into the floodlight control panel beside him, plunging half the shipyard into sudden, disorienting darkness. Chaos erupted. Gunshots flashed in the blackness. Isabella's men, momentarily blinded, fired wildly. Alessandro's snipers, now with the advantage of night vision and chaos, began picking off targets. Alessandro didn't run for cover. He charged forward, a wraith in the strobing muzzle flashes, his target singular. Alice. The man holding her was disoriented. Alessandro slammed into him with the force of a freight train, driving an elbow into his throat. The man crumpled, gasping. Alessandro grabbed Alice, pulling her behind the flimsy cover of a rusted forklift. "Stay down," he ordered, his body shielding hers as bullets ricocheted off the metal around them. The betrayal, however, was not yet complete. In the confusion, Vincent saw his chance. This was not just about helping Isabella win. It was about eliminating his rivals. He raised his own pistol and aimed it squarely at Marco's back. But Marco was no fool. Alessandro's strange command, the immediate turn, had put him on high alert. He had felt Vincent's presence behind him a second too late. As Vincent fired, Marco twisted, the bullet that was meant for his heart tearing through his shoulder instead. He cried out in pain, but brought his own weapon around, firing a single, precise shot. Vincent staggered back, a look of shock on his face, before collapsing to the ground. Isabella screamed in rage as her perfectly laid trap fell apart. "Kill him! Kill them all!" But her men were in disarray, caught between the darkness and the deadly accuracy of Alessandro's hidden snipers. Her advantage was gone. Seeing the tide turn, she made a decision. She grabbed Liam, who was cowering nearby, and pressed a gun to his head. "Cease fire!" she shrieked. "Everyone, or the boy dies!" The shooting sputtered to a stop, leaving an eerie silence, broken only by the groans of the wounded. "It's over, Alessandro," Isabella spat, backing away, dragging Liam with her towards a waiting car. "This isn't a win, it's a reprieve. I'll be back for everything you hold dear." Alessandro rose from behind the forklift, pulling a trembling Alice with him. His face was granite. He watched Isabella disappear into the night with the brother who had sold his sister for a pittance. He had saved Alice, but he had lost a battle, exposed a traitor, and shown his greatest weakness to his most dangerous enemy. Marco stumbled over, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "Boss." "Vincent, I know," Alessandro said, his voice heavy with the weight of the night's revelations. He looked down at Alice. Her face was pale, streaked with grime, her eyes filled with a terrifying mix of emotions: fear, relief, and the deep, cutting pain of his earlier words. "Was it true?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What you said? That I was just a convenience?" He looked at her, at the woman who had somehow breached the impenetrable walls around his heart, the woman for whom he had just been willing to sacrifice his entire world. In the grim, bloody aftermath of the battle, surrounded by the dead and the dying, he gave her the only truth that mattered. "No," he said, his voice raw. "It was the only lie I've ever told that I hoped you would believe." The ride back to the penthouse was a tense, wounded silence. Alice sat beside Alessandro, the space between them charged with the night's violence and his cutting words at the shipyard. His admission that he'd lied had only complicated the raw emotions between them. Back in the sterile beauty of the apartment, the adrenaline faded, leaving only exhaustion. Alessandro stood by the window, the city lights reflecting in his troubled eyes. The night had cost him dearly, a traitor in his inner circle, and his greatest weakness revealed to his most dangerous enemy. "You do not belong in this world, Alice," he said, turning to face her, his voice heavy. "My selfishness in keeping you here almost got you killed tonight. I can't let that happen again." Alice's heart seized. She knew what was coming. "I have arranged everything," he continued, his tone formal, detached. "A new identity, a passport, a bank account with enough money to live anywhere you choose. You can go back to school, have the life you were meant to have, far away from all of this. You will be free." He was offering her the door to the gilded cage. It was everything she should have wanted: safety, a future, a life without fear. And yet, the thought of walking through that door, of leaving him, was a pain worse than any fear she had ever known. This dangerous man had become her sanctuary. Tears welled in her eyes. "You're just going to send me away?" "I'm going to save you," he corrected, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. "You already did," she said, taking a brave step closer, placing her hand on his chest. "But what if I don't want to be saved that way? What if I don't want to run?" She looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. "You told me I don't belong in your world. Maybe you're right. But what if I want to?" Alessandro looked down at her, his composure finally cracking. He saw not a victim, but a woman of incredible strength who looked at him, a monster, and was not afraid. "Alice, you don't know what you're asking," he rasped. "To be with me is a life of shadows. There is no peace here." "You are my peace," she whispered, the truth of it stunning them both. "I choose this. I choose you." Her declaration shattered his final defense. He had spent his life building walls, and she had walked through them as if they were nothing. "This will scar you," he warned, his voice a broken whisper as he lowered his forehead to hers. "We all have scars, Alessandro," she replied, her fingers curling into his shirt. "I'm just choosing mine." With a low groan of surrender, he closed the final distance, his lips meeting hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a raw, desperate claiming, a fusion of darkness and light. It was the sealing of a pact, a promise made in the heart of the storm. The war was far from over. But now, he would not face it alone. The shy waitress who had slipped him a note had done more than save his life. She had given him one worth fighting for. And so, a story that began with a whispered warning on a folded napkin became a love story forged in fire and betrayal. Alice and Alessandro's journey shows us that sometimes the greatest strength is found in the quietest souls, and the most impenetrable hearts can be captured by an unexpected act of courage. Theirs is a world of danger, where every sunrise is a victory and trust is the most valuable currency. But together, they have found a kingdom of their own, not built on fear, but on a fierce, unyielding love. What did you think of Alice's choice? Was it bravery, or was she trading one cage for another? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were captivated by this story of romance and suspense, please give this video a huge thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. And if you don't want to miss what happens next in the world of secrets and shadows, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.